So it's great to see everyone. It's funny, it's such a niche thing that we created, but it's getting so popular and so many people are so interested in it. It's really heartening because it was a lot of work, as you're going to see the process that we went through. So really the story is about challenging the assumptions of legibility and accessibility. It was a journey for us creating it, and that's kind of why it's called that. But I think it's a really important journey to understand, and it's nice to see so many people here caring about not just legibility, but also accessibility. So, as Carlos said, there's myself, Craig Dobie, and Brad Scott and Elliot Scott. One little funny thing is my name is always in between Brad Scott and Elliot Scott, because even though they look a bit like each other, they're not related to each other at all.
We look identical. It's terrifying. We didn't start out looking the same. I had hair. I didn't have a beard. It's a nightmare.
We actually have a client who doesn't believe us.
Yeah.
He's like, I spent time with the brothers. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I was like, you really think we're brothers?
Nephew relation.
You ready for the second part of the joke?
Yeah. What's also funny is they're Scott by name, but I was born in Scotland, so I'm actually the Scott by birth.
He says
So
he wants to shoehorn himself into our joke.
I put myself in the middle, that's why. Okay, so a little bit, the story today is going to be a little bit about applied, how we do work, how we approach work, because that sort of informs how we became to work with the Braille Institute. And then a lot of the presentation is actually about the typeface itself and the work that went into that. But the first thing that we really wanted to sort of get out of the way in the Type Directors Club is that we are not typographers.
In fact, I lost an internship because my type skills were so poor. So.
But that's actually a big part of the story, because that was probably true at the beginning. I think we learned a lot about typography through this process. And that's kind of who we are in a way, because we also weren't experts in recycling and waste management either. But we worked on a program many years ago for Central Park that was about waste management and the controlling of all the waste and the recycling inside Central Park. And as a part of that project, we created these garbage cans with a wider team. We didn't know anything about garbage and recycling when we started, and we know a lot now. This won the first ever Product Design Can Award. And what that really taught us was it's okay to not know what you're doing at the beginning. As long as you're passionate and you're determined to do a great job, you can really pretty much do anything. And I think the font in the story tonight is a little bit about that attitude. So a little bit more about Applied. We do work for the Port Authority, for the World Trade Center, so the rebuilding and rebirth of that entire area. It started when some of us worked on the 9/11 memorial branding, but this part that we do now, or have been doing for the last 8 or so years, is the commercial side, so the transport and the retail and all the other stuff that needed to also go back. So we've been working on that for a long, long time and doing lots of different things. We did a lot of signage and wayfinding, as well as branding and so forth. We do work with Riverside Park Conservancy. The issue they had was that most people don't know that the park is not run solely by the Parks Department. The Conservancy needs to generate money in order to run the park. But like many park logos, their logo was green. And in a park that is green most of the year, you just don't even see it. It's just camouflage. So what was important about this design is this color of yellow. The yellow helps it stand out in the park, but it's not incongruent with the park itself. The color came from the original trees that were planted when the park was created 150 years ago. And those are honey locust, and they turn this amazing flat color yellow in the autumn. So for 50 weeks of the year, this stands out really, really, really well. And people become aware that there's a conservancy that needs to generate money in order to make the park the amazing thing that it is. All 6 miles of it, it's a very big park. But for 2 weeks of the year, this totally blends in to the yellow of the park in all its kind of autumn glory. Other things we do a lot of work for NYU Langone. So while we're not doctors, we do know a lot about healthcare and hospitals and all that kind of stuff. We do work with business improvement districts. If someone doesn't know what business improvement district is, like Times Square Partnership or Union Square Partnership, they levy a charge to the businesses there and they improve the area. So Hudson Square, if you don't know, because most people didn't know where it was, even though that's been the name for 100 years or so, is above Tribeca, west of Soho, and south of the village. And it's an amazing place. So if you're around there, look out for this stuff. And the thing that sort of connects all those different projects together and the different things that we do for those organizations isn't immediately apparent, I think, to most of the people that we speak to. But the thing that connects it is they are all mission-based organizations with a very clear goal that they want to achieve. And that's where we do really well. We're not setting the goal, we're just trying to help them achieve that goal. And we do a great job of that. And that's what led us to start our work with the Braille Institute. And Brad's going to talk about that.
Thanks, Craig. So, as Craig said, we do a lot with mission-based businesses. And it's weird because if you would have asked, we started Applied about 5 years ago now. If you would have asked like what we would have been doing, I would never have guessed that this would have been the path. And honestly, I would never guess that I'd be standing in front of the Type Directors Club talking about a typeface that was really predicated on accessibility and a conversation. So to understand how this came to be, I think you really need to understand who Braille Institute is. I mean, you all know what Braille is, correct? Like, obviously, it's the code. They were founded in 1919 at a time when Braille publications were incredibly expensive to produce. They have been in existence now for 100 years, and their sole mission was to basically increase Braille literacy and to also make Braille affordable to the people who use Braille because it was so tremendously expensive. They were founded by a guy named J. Robert Atkinson, who wasn't born without sight, but through an accident, he was basically a cowboy. He lost his sight and said, you know, this is an amazing thing that we have to bring to the world. And he did, and he worked tirelessly to do it. What's interesting is that over the years, what's happened is that Braille and people, so if you're born without vision, you are going to be taken care of by the state in the United States. When he started Braille, you weren't. So one of the very first stories that our clients told us, they said, you know, the cartoon of the blind person in the 30s with the pencils, like on the street, that was real. That's what you were destined to be unless you came from a very wealthy family. And part of the reason why was that the language acquisition, your brain actually works a little bit differently when you read than when you hear. And it's through hearing and reading and kind of those types of stimuli that you develop intellectually. Braille, even though it's raised bumps and it's a code, triggers the same mechanism in the brain. So until Braille came along, you were slightly kind of destined to not being able to accomplish what your brother or sister could, even though your mental faculties were still there. So this was a very important thing to have happen. So when you looked at what happened with Braille and in their mission, they really did achieve that. They were able to raise Braille literacy. They were able to, the first thing they actually converted was the Bible, which like sat in a room as big as this because the volumes were so tremendously large. Then that laddered into them actually becoming the library of record for the Library of Congress for Braille, and then a lending program and all these great things, right? And now fast forward to the 1960s, and what they started to notice was as Braille literacy was starting to increase, people were living longer and they were starting to lose their vision. And all the things that they focused on with people who weren't sighted, they were finding that people were coming to them to be able to learn those tools and techniques to live a fulfilling life. So it was really kind of interesting how over that course of the first 60 or so years of the organization, it changed to not just people who couldn't see, but people who also had troubles with their vision and essentially functioning inside. Their headquarters are based in LA. It's an amazingly terrible but awesome brutalist building. And when I say brutalism, it is brutalism. It's actually California brutalism. It's on the register for a perfect example of California brutalism. So, you know, they really kind of came of age in the 60s. And when you go inside the building, it's kind of exactly what you would expect. I personally find it beautiful. Like, I love going there, and everybody's like, you're crazy, but I do. I think it's fantastic. But they needed a little bit of a refresh, right? Their mission was changing, who they were in the marketplace was changing, and really the people who were coming into their centers was changing. And it really went beyond blindness. They'd become a community center, they'd become an educator, they'd become consultants, they had become really a fabric of the community, but for some odd reason, they just hadn't like kept pace with what was happening in 2019. So we were fortunate that they actually had a new CEO who came in and recognized this and said, man, there's some amazing stuff that's happening here, but if we don't get on this quickly enough, our mission we may not be able to achieve our mission because we're just not going to have the relevance that we have in the marketplace. So the brief was pretty simple. The Braille Institute has been helping people see beyond vision loss and live enriched lives for over a century, okay? But in recent years, it's become more of a community center than a leader in vision rehabilitation. So that brutalist building, they actually had 7 of those throughout the LA area. And they had really become community centers. And what they needed to do now is to reestablish themselves as experts in helping people with low vision and helping people with Braille literacy. And people just didn't know that that's what they were really all about. The reason why was with the country's aging population and an increase in diabetes and other factors, vision loss and low vision is expected to increase in adults and youth. And Braille Institute had 100 years of helping. So it's pretty phenomenal. We'll get into this a little bit more, but we're seeing this happen across healthcare in general, that people start living past 60 and things start giving out, right? Your eyes start to get a little bit bad, but not just a little bit bad, you start to have actual degenerative diseases that can start to affect you. So the good thing is, the alternative of not living long isn't that good, right? That's death. Or you live with these issues. And increasingly, we're seeing these issues come to the foreground because our population, all of us, are aging. I hate to tell everybody this, but we're all getting older. That's the way it goes. So we really were engaged to shift the perceptions, right? It was about Braille Institute supplementing its focus on blindness care and actually moving to what they call vision loss rehabilitation. And that's kind of a big deal, honestly, because what it says when you say rehabilitation is that if you do suddenly have some sort of degenerative eye disease, that you can rehabilitate it. And you can rehabilitate it in any number of ways. It could be actually through physical rehabilitation, or it could be through augmentation in what you use, whether it be with a smartphone or a reader or something like that. But what we had to really help people understand was that this is where you go to find out about that stuff. It's not just a community center. It's not just a brutalist building that happens to be just north of downtown. But this is where you go to actually continue to live the life that you've been living. Okay, makes sense? Everybody good with that? Great. So, it was a branding project. Like, we're a branding company. It's kind of like what we do. So let's talk about it a little bit. So we developed a mission statement. I mean, they did it too. This was in concert with them. But Braille Institute is a nonprofit organization that embraces the challenge of sight loss in all its facets and rejects its perceived limitations with the belief that vision rehabilitation is a beginning and not an end. That was their core mission. It was great. So that became the foundation for basically everything that we did from a visual perspective as well as from a verbal perspective. And the mantra was no boundaries in sight. Nice play on words, but this really resonated with them to say, we're not putting boundaries, we're not putting limitations on ourselves, but we are going to help you and help our communities continue to live the life that they want to live. So that became the rallying cry, both for the organization and for the rest of the work that followed. So with that, we're going to turn it back over to Craig.
So at this stage, it's just a regular branding project, right? With a very kind of important mission that we all really believed in, that we would need to do our best. So we created a logo, like you do, and color palette, layouts. Layouts are kind of important because how people read, I'll get to that in a minute. Imagery, the messaging and the way those messages are delivered, and also typography that we will really get to in a little bit. So we created a logo that talks about not just people that are blind and what they need, but also low vision, like Brad was talking about. So the logo is simply the combination of Roman alphabet B for the people that can see to some degree, plus the I from the Braille algorithm or code brought together into this simple shape. So it just says BI. It's very simple. Clearly, the shapes had to be simple enough and have high enough contrast that they would be easily read by people that can't see that well. And a little story that I really like is the sort of visual poetry of the negative space inside the counter of the B plus the positive space from the other part of the I is sort of beckoning that white dot to come and fill that B. And that's really about this sort of accessibility message of come in, participate, and be together. We also looked very carefully at color. Obviously, Braille has low vision specialists, so we worked very closely with them on selecting the right kind of colors. There's kind of like a two-prong thing that needs to happen for the colors. One is it needs to be accessible. You need to be able to see it. They have to have a high contrast. But also, it has to help shift the perception, so there's a style element to that also. But you might see that there's like PMS colors and hex colors, and there's also these other numbers. Those numbers are the contrast ratios between that color and white. And it was kind of amazing. Like a really high contrast, like black and white is as high as it gets, is in the sort of 20-ish, 21. And then very quickly it drops off. It's not really a straight line curve. So something like this, which is very dark and still highly legible, is a 14. So working very closely with the low vision specialists, we create the different color palette for style, but also for use, and made sure that we test them with the low vision students that are there to see that they can identify different things if they're color-coded or how the layouts are sort of organized. We also did an illustration style to make that very inviting. So it's very sort of poetic and playful and youthful without being young necessarily. And another great thing about the illustration style is it can cover some subjects. If you're newly losing your vision, some of those subjects are pretty hard to swallow. So this can sort of use more conceptual ways of depicting those situations rather than photography. And of course, the layouts have to be very strong. They have to, if you're using a reader, you're not seeing the whole page at a time. So we put things in very consistent places. We make the type large, obviously, and just make things very kind of logical in the flow that they go through and consistent across materials. And I'm going to hand it back to Elliot for this, the typography part, because that also was an important decision.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, we're talking about typography now. Obviously, it's a major component in this branding project, and it's what people need to read, right? So when we started it, we started thinking about typography. We started with some fundamental questions. Should it be serif? Should it be sans serif? Serifs are great. They're used in books, you know. You read a lot, highly legible. And the Braille Institute had been using serifs for their typography for many years. But it wasn't the right tone, right? Didn't signal the right message. The branding project was to sort of change from being community-centered to being these thought leaders or helping rehabilitation, that kind of thing. So I thought maybe a serif is probably better, more modern. It says the right thing, it says the right tone. But what kind of sans serif? There's grotesque. Franklin Gothic here is an example. There's neo-grotesque. Helvetica is an example. Geometrics, avant-garde, real circular A there. Or the humanist, like Frutiger. Neo-grotesque felt right. It was in that sort of modernist style. The buildings, everything's very 60s. It felt like that's what the answer wanted to be. But the humanists, they were they were legible, right? We wanted to sort of try both out. We tried out the modernist but less legible, and the legible humanist but has less character. It's a little soulless. It's like you see in an airport, and it's great for like finding your way around, but didn't feel right, didn't say the right thing. Really, there wasn't an answer. We couldn't find the right typeface for their project, for their branding project. So we made our own. I guess this is really the start of the presentation. 10 things that drove the design of Atkinson Hyperlegible. Oh, Brad.
So, I already mentioned this, so it was kind of an amazing moment, right, where and you realize, like, as a designer, you have an opportunity to do something. You don't know quite what it is yet. You don't know quite why. And when all of a sudden I saw the sketches, I mean, I'm the managing director. Like, I get to look at the amazing work that the design team does. And I remember just looking at it going, sure, why not? This makes perfect sense. And then we realized, like, really quickly, all the time that we had put into all the other elements to kind of not make the most important element truest to this group of people who needed it most would be a fail, right? So it was pretty amazing. So with that said, it was low vision, as I said, it affects millions of people. I mean, you heard the stat, it's 100 million people worldwide, but over 400 million Americans aged 40 years and older suffer from uncorrectable vision impairment. How many people here are over 40? Okay.
No one.
Great, I see some in the back.
There's a bunch in the back.
It's kind of scary how quickly at about age 39, 40, 41, you start to rapidly lose your vision, right? And it just kind of goes from there. So it's one of these things that it's good to be thinking about it now and really making sure that you're taking care of your eyes. It's projected to affect millions more, not in the distant future. So by 2050, we're going to be at 8.9 million, right? The current rate of Americans with vision impairments is expected to double to nearly 9 million by 2050. So it's pretty significant, and it's something that cuts across socioeconomic boundaries and everything else. One of the major drivers is diabetes. So that leads to diabetic retinopathy, which is a leading cause of blindness in working age Americans. So, if you know anybody who has diabetes, it's just kind of a brutal side effect of kind of a horrible thing that sets in if you haven't taken care of yourself throughout your life, or if your genes aren't what they should be. 1 in 10 by age 80, 1 in 10 Americans has late-stage AMD, so that's age-related macular degeneration. We're living longer, right? So the number of people who are living into their 80s is exceeding, although the minute I say that, I know somebody's going to go, yeah, but last year the age expectancy went down. It did, but for the most part, it's the first time that we have a lot of people living past 80, and it's just, things start to wear out. Fewer than 10% of the 1.3 million people who are legally blind in the United States are Braille readers, which is kind of amazing because you think of these things as like you go blind and you learn Braille, and that's not the case 9 times out of 10. You go blind, you're 60 years old, you're 80 years old, you're not going to be learning Braille, but you still want to read, and you still need to communicate, you still need to see short messages to get you through a space. So it's a very important thing. The other thing that we really, I think, came to appreciate in our own studio was that even though we were designing for an aging population or for people who are losing their sight, something like this actually benefits everybody. Because what we started to learn was the younger family members who were stressed out, who were reading the material, were starting to understand, were able to comprehend the material a little bit better because it wasn't fatiguing their eyes and they weren't struggling to read it. So regardless of whether you're losing your vision or not, you will benefit from something that's made to be more legible. So that was one of the other driving factors in the design of this. So just the stats were driving this design alone.
So one of the other things that's really came to light was the typeface is really about improving quality of life. Like if you unpack changing the typeface into its basic elements, it's letter form differentiation is kind of the key. It increases letter recognition. Letter recognition increases or improves legibility. That lets you read faster. Reading faster improves your comprehension, which is the key to understanding. So an ability to understand more leads to doing more things, having a better life, and a higher quality of life. So it sort of became increasingly important, or clear to us, the importance of getting the letter forms right and working really hard on the tiny details, because they really affect the big picture. And what also sort of revealed to us was that letter ambiguity is prevalent. It's kind of the tradition of how typefaces are made. That harmony of letter forms really reduces the legibility. So typically when a typeface is made, it uses key parts to create harmony across the typeface. That's what kind of gives it its style. So certain elements will be repeated and reused in order to make it harmonious and beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. But in reality, that's making it harder to differentiate between the letters and therefore harder to read. And ultimately, for those people, lowering their quality of life. Back to Ellie.
Okay, so this is Helvetica, obviously. And the truth is, we really want to use Helvetica. Helvetica felt right. It was, it felt like the right typeface for them. It's modernist, felt the right style. But we just couldn't do it. We couldn't allow ourselves to do it because, like Craig said, it's very harmonious, but there's like this ambiguity in the letter forms. The lowercase L looks like a capital I, exactly. It looks a lot like the exclamation point. It looks like the 1. It looks like a lowercase I. And these circular shapes, they're very similar as well, right? The Q, the O, we couldn't bring ourselves to use Helvetica. Here, the B and the 8, quite similar. These basically circular shapes with lines sticking out of them. But we wanted the style of Helvetica. Here's these sort of mound shapes. So Atkinson Hyperlegible, it breaks some of the traditional type rules. It breaks some of the those harmonious things that make it feel right, but it breaks them for the right reasons. So here's Atkinson Hyperlegible as the sort of the more popular characters. And what we did was Helvetica on the left here, Atkinson on the right. We did a test. We did a simple test, and we changed the letter forms to be less ambiguous. Basically, there's the B and the 8. When it's hard to see, they're very similar in Helvetica. So the top of the 8 in Atkinson is smaller, so that it has a different sort of profile than the B. These letters that were giving us trouble when it's hard to see them. The I sort of kinks out. It's got that little tail on it, and the L has a little spur on the bottom as well. We did things like, with the exclamation point, made the dot and the line a little bit further away from each other, so that when it's hard to see, it's clearer what the characters are. Opening up the counters, shortening the terminals to make it clearer that this is a C and not that smudgy, maybe it's a C, maybe it's an O in Helvetica. Sometimes it was very, very subtle, but just extending the F a little bit, just a little tiny bit, or extending the tail of the T a little tiny bit helps push them further apart. Sometimes it was a bit more obvious. The Q in Helvetica is very much like the O. I want to say tail of the Q is kind of tiny in Helvetica, so we exaggerated it for Atkinson. It fills in, sure, but it's clearly not an O. And then something like a 0, there's similar profile, but it's hard to tell what's a circle with the hole in the middle for an O or a circle with a hole in the middle for a 0. So we put a slash in there. Oh, that's you, Brad.
No,
Oh.
So this is just kind of going on a little tangent to understand about low vision. It's a great way to illustrate it through blurry vision. Everybody goes, I close my eyes a little bit, I can see it well. But low vision isn't actually just about blurry vision, and this was another thing that we had to truly understand. There are many types of low vision, and there's many types of vision loss. And we worked with the specialists at Braille to understand kind of what the most common were and what the techniques or what the effects of those diseases happen to have on the people that were going to be using the font. So here's an illustration that shows this. So we have our normal vision here. And then if you experience macular degeneration, you actually lose the ability to see in the center of the eye. So you can see kind of in the peripheral. So the net result of that is that when people are being retaught how to read, they're taught to move their heads like this to be able to catch those characters in their peripheral vision, or depending on what's going on, to basically kind of counter the dark spots. So the idea of blurring this, even though it really kind of helped illustrate it on a poster, isn't what's actually happening in a lot of the cases. Blurriness is happening to somebody who has to go to reading glasses, but it's not necessarily happening with somebody who's diagnosed with low vision. So retinitis pigmentosa, one of my more favorite ones to say, means you have the exact opposite. You see things in the center, but you can't see things on the periphery. So imagine how important each one of the glyphs becomes as you focus in on it. But again, it's the same types of techniques. Cataracts is actually, interestingly, wasn't a big issue for us because cataract surgery has become so affordable and so effective. In fact, my dad, who's 80 now, had cataract surgery. He's been wearing glasses since he was 22, and he probably should have been wearing glasses since he was 12, but didn't know it. He now has 20/20 vision because of cataract surgery. He's like, and he still wears glasses for one reason. He has a dent in his nose. And he does, when he doesn't put his glasses on, he's like, I got this big dent in my nose. So he wears glasses purely for that reason. So interestingly, cataracts is, and this is what we want, right? We want these things to be able to be fixed. Diabetic retinopathy is basically like spots. If you've ever knocked your head, you kind of get little spots. It's similar to that. And then total blindness isn't black, right? You can still see highlights and things, but it's difficult to differentiate between the characters, or between what you're seeing. So now that we've kind of shared with you what we did mechanically through the blurry test, now think about this as an individual who's having to actually move their head to be able to recognize the characters.
There's a little nuance. I just want to add to that. I'm gonna go back. The macular degeneration, right? Yeah, you can't see in the middle. Your vision is lost in the middle there, but even your periphery, like people with good eyesight, their peripheries are blurrier, right? And the problem also is that these things stack together sometimes, and there's like a lot of different things going on. So there's vision loss, and there's these types of low vision, and then there's just poor vision as well, and there can be a combination of all those different things. So what we did was we sort of factor those things into the typeface as well. Helvetica on the left there. The B and the R don't look all that similar, but if you've got the macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, if you've got that one with the splotches, maybe a splotch is going to cover the bottom of the R or the bottom of the B. And then it's like you can't really tell what they are, even though if it was blurry, you would be able to. So we put something like an angle on the R, so that if you just catch it, and you're moving your head around, you just catch it, it helps trigger, oh, this is an R. There's a lot of little details like that put into the typeface. Again, here, this is a more subtle one, but if you've got a splotch covering the N here, and it looks like an R, it looks a lot like the Helvetica. In Helvetica, the R and that N that's covered, they look very similar. So we dropped the point where the arm comes out from the stem. We added details like the Q has the curlier tail, the hook on the tail, to help distinguish, again, because the diabetic retinopathy, the bottom of the P or the bottom of the R could be covered, so we need signals to sort of indicate that this is an R, or a P, this is a Q, again, details like that.
So one of the other things we were really kind of working with is that form follows context. We made the typeface so that it's easy to read if you can see well, and easier to read if you cannot see well. Because Braille's audience, there's really three of them. There are the people who have low vision, then there's their loved ones that are helping them, because it's a journey that really requires some help at the beginning. That person may have great vision or may have poor vision. They don't necessarily have low vision, but they might have poor vision. And then the third audience is the physicians and the ophthalmologists who have been trying to help these people save their eyesight and have run out of options. And basically, they're the people that refer their patients to the Braille Institute to help rehabilitate them. So all three of those audiences have some slightly different needs, but Braille doesn't have the kind of money or the resources to make a brochure for each of those three different groups. So everything is made to be read by everybody. So that gave us a little bit of a challenge, because if it had only been about strong letter differentiation, we could have achieved that with a kind of ransom note type style, right? Where you borrow just whatever you want from anywhere, and you can recognize each of those letters really well, but nobody wants to read that. Probably even a person with low vision won't read that well either, because it'll be slow to read, even though you can really see the differentiated letters. So walking that fine line between both visually appealing to a regular reader, but also being highly legible for the people that need it, was not easy, but it was a big thing we had to take on. But I think what we discovered, this seems really obvious now at the end of it, it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but it wasn't obvious to us at the beginning, is that there's so many situations where increased legibility benefits everybody, whether it's a highway sign, anywhere where you've got like a fast read. So that could be you're moving quickly or you need to read it very quickly. So a highway sign, or if you glance down at your car dashboard and you want to get that information, high legibility is really important there. And then things like in this building, any building where there's fire and life signage, that if there's an emergency, you need to leave the building, hyperlegible typeface would be amazing there, because that's what you need to know, to get that information and get it quickly.
So like Craig said, this is a typeface for everybody, right? But it's specifically for the Braille, or it was designed specifically for the Braille Institute. So we wanted it to sort of not just function. It's not just about the legibility. I mean, that's obviously a critical component, but character as well, style as well is important, right? It needs to feel right for them. It started as a custom typeface for the Braille Institute. So there's little details, little nods to their heritage. Braille dots, obviously, when you think of Braille, you think of these like circular shapes. So we incorporated circular forms. They function, the 8 functions, but the percent sign didn't need to be a perfect circle, but we made it a perfect circle just so it felt right for them. What's the dot on the A called? Whatever. Modifier ring. There we go. The circle above the A And the degree sign, again, circular forms. And circular little details in the punctuation. This one was more of a functional thing too. But we added nice little details into the quotation marks, into the question mark. The question mark, the exclamation point, those are functional as well as style, but a circle for a period just feels right. It feels nice for them. And because we sort of deviated from Helvetica's ultra-rational harmony, we needed to sort of harmonize the typeface a little bit in other ways. So we added put a little angle on the spurs, just as a subtle little detail to sort of disconnect things together. When they're feeling a little bit disparate, we just put that in there as a little detail to sort of bring it together. It did add a little subtle functional detail too, because it opens up that space. It stops it from it sort of stops it from filling in. We angled the terminals as well. Sometimes it was beneficial, like on the S, and sometimes it was more just for style, like on this J. But it let us open up things like the E, like the lowercase g. It let us get sort of change the forms a little bit. We tried a bunch of different things with the angles. Originally, they were all exactly the same, and it was nice. It felt right. It was like it was a nice design detail, but it meant that there was some like weird angles going on. Sometimes it was a little too shallow. Like on this lowercase g, the angle cut the terminal in a strange way. And so we were like debating back and forth, should we make them all exactly the same or should we change them? And we ended up changing them so that it functions better. They end in an angle, but we were deviating from like the strict thing just for like it breaks the rules for the right reasons. Back to that. And sometimes we added details just because it just worked better in certain places. We created a tabular one that makes it monowidth, helps in tables, helps in reading statistics, stuff like that. It itself is no more or less legible than the standard one, but when it works as a set, when you're working in tables, it adds a little bit. And when we were making these changes, I want to thank Megan for doing a lot of this work. She jumped in with the modifier ring there. We noticed that some of the smallest little changes had a huge impact on like the overall feeling of the typeface. So we had to balance this goal of like being highly legible. That's in the name. It's this like bold claim, hyper legible. We had to sort of try to live up to that, but also convey the right style. It went back to sort of that original choice of what kind of sans serif. Do we go with a neo-grotesque or do we go with like a humanist? It goes back to that sort of question. And we were drawing different forms of these Fs, the arrows indicating the one we ended up with. But the middle one, it's like, it's got that curve, and it was a way to sort of try to sort of distinguish it from like T. We ended up going with the one with the arrow because it was taller. It went above the regular sort of cap height, which is kind of a strange thing to do for a lowercase f. But again, it's that breaking the rules for the right reasons kind of thing. It allowed us to keep the crossbar at a sort of nice height, but going above. The G, we tried a bunch of different Gs. At the very last second, we changed. We had a more of a Frutiger style of G, like this one here, or this one here. It felt right. It let us get this space open more than this one over here. But tonally, it felt disconnected from the rest of the typeface, so much so that we couldn't sort of accept it. So we went to this style. It let us get this open space bigger, and that sort of balanced it out, I think. Cap Gs, we tried a bunch of different things. How long does that crossbar go? How deep does it go into the G? What height does it go? Does it sit at? Sort of ended up in sort of sweet spot. Even things like the lowercase I, which we put on all the posters because it's like cool looking, but we tried different lengths of the tail or that sort of middle point thing. Different lengths of that, different thicknesses of it. Like the rationalist in us, we wanted to make it an even thickness, like this one is. And it, as an individual character, it looked right. It felt like, yeah, that looks good. But when it sat alongside other letters in words, when you're trying to actually read it, it didn't really work. It was too thick. So we did other things. We tried raising, lowering the height of the tittle, making it bigger or smaller. Ended up on the one on the right. Same thing with the J. Extending, shortening, curving, flattening the tail, or the tittle again. That one matches the I. And then, like I said, with the R, the lowercase r, dropping the point where the arm meets the stem. It let us distinguish it from the lowercase n, and it let us be clearly an R, but it jumps up to the X height, or the curved X height. And sort of what I was sort of getting at was, initially we created a real short character set version. I think there's like 100-something characters. This is a temporary version, so that the Braille Institute didn't have to wait like months for us to build the font. The full thing. It's just a brief, a limited character set of Atkinson Hyperlegible temp, and that's used in some of the examples that Craig showed originally. And then that was tested and worked with the low vision experts at the Braille Institute, and got feedback internally from them and externally from other people, and we made some changes, and that's what this next section will be. Yeah, so we incorporated into the current version of Atkinson Hyperlegible, something like here, the E. We got some feedback. We really need to open up the counter, the bottom counter, a little bit more. So we did that, opened it up. We changed again the angle of the terminal to be a bit shallower. It lets it be open more. Changing the position of the crossbar, changing the length of the top curve, lowering the connection of the R. These are iterations that we did between the temp version and the current version. More dramatic angles in that capital R. It's kind of a striking character now. Yeah, we originally had a flat terminal on the J, but we wanted to harmonize a little bit more, so yeah, I think it works better. Somebody made a comment that the P and the D, when you hide the ascender or the descender, they're very much the same. They're both circles with the spur on it. So a little detail, adding a little curve on the D spur, just helps distinguish it a little bit better. Exaggerating some of the curves or changing the shapes of some of the curves a little bit helped us just improve the characters. We increased the size of some of the accents and moved them away from the lowercase and the capitals a little bit, because they're getting a little cluttered. They were getting a little hard to read. The full character set has 248 characters. It's got a bunch of accents. It's got some like crazy ones I can't remember the names of. It's like lowercase thorn, who I don't know who uses that, but we have that in there. It matches the Dobie Latin 2 character set, so that's like somewhat of an industry standard. It's enough to be like comprehensive, and not so much that it never gets released.
That's up for debate.
Well, And two things here. One that's not really visible. We increase the size of all the punctuation just a little bit to help distinguish, because these aren't letters. They're reading tools, I guess. So we increase the size of that just a little bit. And we increase the spacing a little bit, like between the words. When you type a space character, it's a little bit bigger than a standard one, just to help break up the letters. Oh, who's this? You? Oh, yeah.
So when Elliot first said, well, we can't find a typeface that's right, I can't really use any of these and feel like we're doing the best job possible, maybe we should make one, in that kind of voice. Mm-hmm. One of the first things that we kind of thought about was, well, we're going to break a lot of rules, and a lot of people might not like that very much. Lots of particularly people who like type like to comment on that type. So when in September we won the award from Fast Company, people started to get to see it. People that weren't low vision specialists, people that weren't us, but people that did know type. And Brand New picked it up and shared it as a noted post. And so this thing that you can clearly see they worked so hard on was going to be evaluated by people that know something. Maybe some people know a lot, some people less. So a lot of the comments were actually positive, which was great. So we're going to read a couple of them. So R.C. Armstrong said, I wear glasses. My eyesight is pretty lousy. I took them off and sat back and was able to read a sample spread from the link with little difficulty. Hats off to them. So that was good, right? This is a poor vision person, not a low vision person, but it's proof that it's working. Other feedback was critical, but it was quite constructive. So we tried really hard to embrace it when we were making the second version. So Janik said, I'm a bit skeptical for several of the letters, especially the 0, which looks like a Danish letter, long O, or whatever that is.
Oh, the slash.
And judging by Janik's name, probably he's Danish and he knows what he's talking about. Here you go. He was right. They do look very similar. So it's such an iterative process, and we're trying to be open-minded and not be precious about anything. We're trying to, every time we get feedback from low vision or wherever, if it's good feedback, we're going to incorporate it. So we just flipped it the other way. And then the way we tested this is kind of funny. Megan was kind of the test guinea pig. She had been working on it for months, and I suggested we flip it. Elliot flips it, prints out a piece of text, puts it on the wall, and then asks Megan what's wrong with it.
No, it was like, what do you think of the kerning here?
Oh, yeah.
Some like bullshit excuse.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
We tricked her.
Yeah. It was lies.
She didn't notice, so we're like, okay, that's good. This is maybe a candidate. So. But some of the other things that came up, Elliot's going to talk about now, were also very interesting.
Yeah, so one of the comments in Brand New was kind of blew our minds a little bit. Very well done. Makes me question if ethically all fonts should be hyperlegible. And we sort of marinate on that. We're like, should they be? Somebody else replied to them, that would limit fonts by a lot. I agree fonts should be legible due to their function, but hyperlegible I could see being a category on its own. And we talked a lot about that. We were like internally debating it. I think the three of us have 4 opinions. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question. This has led to discussions between us. I don't know. What do you guys think? This is kind of our Q&A part of it. Yeah. Is there any questions? Any comments? Be nice.
I think it's interesting that hyperlegible is not a legit term. It's an Elliot term, but it seems to make sense, right? I'm sure it's going to catch on. So just any questions about that particular question, or any questions in general?
Yeah, so you guys mentioned you got feedback on the legibility of it.
Mm-hmm.
in comparison to like Helvetica, it is like much more legible. How much more legible is that? Is there like, was there like a measurable difference?
So it's a great question, and this is a very long-winded answer to your question. We thought that there would be, because we reached out to Google accessibility team, we reached out to Microsoft accessibility teams. What you find really quickly is there really isn't a standard way of measuring it. In fact, a lot of the feedback we got were from them. They're like, oh, the counter on that E needs to be opened up a little bit. And we're like, yeah, you're right. Okay, great. But help us, like, what do we do? Like, and they're like, just open up the E, you know? And it's not to dismiss what they do, but there wasn't a standard. So, like, I'm sitting there like, oh, man, we got to figure this out. So I called MIT. MIT has an age lab, or an aging lab. They've done a lot of work with monotype. We reached out to them, and it kind of like, there wasn't a standard there either. Theirs was about speed, scannability, especially for like in-dash vehicles. Amazing body of research, but there wasn't like a standard. So we've been actually working with a research company to develop a standard to be able to measure the increase in efficacy for the particular font phase. With that said though, there's not going to be a single answer, right? And I think that that's kind of the coolest part of this whole project is this is one thing that's going to help some people have better legibility, but it's not going to help everybody. And that kind of goes back to that question, should all fonts be hyperlegible, right? And you know, to kind of swing back to that question, some should, because some people, that's what they need. But this isn't the only answer to it. It's the dialogue around what makes things accessible, and to actually start to develop a body of work and standards by which to start to judge these things that I think are critical in moving them forward. So that's a very long-winded answer to say we're doing our best to figure it out, but there really aren't standards that say this is what makes it more legible over other typefaces.
Yeah, it's a great question because a lot of people are asking it. And what's really good for the Braille Institute and for the low vision community is it's creating awareness. It's creating the questions themselves, which is helping move the whole thing forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have an answer, let me know.
Yeah, we're open to.
Yeah, we're open to suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, so just to build a little bit more, when the low vision specialist does one-on-one testing with someone who has low vision, they get different answers, different situations almost every time. So we're just trying to incorporate as much of that feedback as possible.
Yeah, and generally it does outperform it. I mean, what we're finding is, especially with scannable type, like directional type, it performs really, really well. It was like, and you're like, awesome. Because like, long copy, I think we need to look at that one a little bit more and say, okay, what are we going to do? But when you think of your day in, day out, short copy kinds of stuff, it performs very, very well.
Yeah, with that sort of building on that a little bit, I mean, to be honest, like it's a typeface. It's not going to solve like low vision all that much. It's a tool. It's one component for vision. There's the color palettes. There's the layouts. There's the amount of information that's being served up, and all these things working together is what Braille Institute's doing to sort of increase legibility.
How would you make it more accessible to the visual impaired population? Like, if I were to read like a BuzzFeed article, I want to read it just as easy as DIY.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there like a keyboard or some sort?
I'll answer from a policy question. One of the things that we're really working hard to do is try to get it as a general install in Mac and Windows and on the Google distribution systems. We've also had conversations with Adobe. So by just virtue of installing it, you know, that would give us the ability to be able to see it a little bit better. That's difficult though. I mean, it's what I find really fascinating about the journey we've been on. If we would have just called it a typeface, we could have gotten it included like that. But because we made a claim about legibility, it goes through a whole other level of scrutiny. So it's pretty interesting. But the other policy side to that is the plan for this particular face, and they're still working the details of this out, is to make it freely available. It is property of the Braille Institute. It's not our property. They'll retain the rights to it, but their goal is to basically let the community have it for use.
For free.
For free. The only nuance to that is we haven't quite figured out commercial use components to it, but those are all like little minor details. But their vision is that the more people who have it, the more benefit and accessibility.
Better for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ooh.
How did you, like when developing it, how did you go about testing and optimizing it for the medium of delivery?
For the medium of delivery.
That is like paper versus screen versus
Uh-huh.
other forms of delivery?
Well, the real answer is the next level, right? It's designed for letters as a letters forms. It's just an open type format, and it prints fine and it's on screen fine, but it's not optimized entirely for screen yet. That's probably a next step or the next step. It's a great question, and it's something that is in the works, but it's a next step. Yeah.
If someone was to design a new typeface that was hyperlegible,
Mm-hmm.
what are your general guidelines or advice that you have for designing the next hyperlegible typeface?
Okay, that's a good question. The comment on brand new, right? Should all fonts be hyperlegible or typefaces be hyperlegible? Was like maybe this isn't a typeface. Maybe it's just an approach, right? I think a lot of the details that we incorporated probably will translate to other typefaces, but probably not all of them, and it probably is a case-by-case kind of thing. This works fine for a modernist type thing. We were talking like, what does a serif look like? And that's a whole other thing, right? How do you make sure that the serifs are legible? How do you, so, I don't know. I don't have an answer for like, how do you, what we did works here, I think, but is it a format? Is it an approach? Maybe. Yeah, we were talking about what do hyperlegible emojis look like, or hyperlegible other things. I don't know. Maybe it's an approach. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just this typeface. But I'd love to see some of the approaches, like some of the details translated to other typefaces. Just as a side note, a lot of these details, like the I there, the lowercase I, you can find that in other typefaces, or you can find a L with a little curve on the bottom. But it's hard to find it with all of those details in one typeface. So maybe if you're gonna make a typeface totally different style with hyperlegible in mind, maybe it's got numerous details in it.
I think it's a great question. I'd love to see some people experiment in different styles with the same basic principle of like letter differentiation, because that's what drove this one. But they're trying to achieve a different style or a different starting point with the same method, you would come up probably with very different, or some very different ways of creating it.
Yeah. First of all, I think this is a beautiful typeface. I think it's awesome to see you produce something with such an intense focus on accessibility, and I think it's just like really cool to see all the details behind that. I have a question. During the development of this, did you also consider people with dyslexia and thinking about differentiating the letter forms that are like often confused for one another?
No, we didn't. But what we did do was there is a wrong choice of words there. There's a typeface that's been designed for people with low vision, and it's a accessible typeface, and it's all of these things and exaggerated to like 100th degree, and it's fine, but it's ugly, right? And it's hard to read. It's hard for everybody to read it. Like Craig said, it's not a ransom note style, but it's so exaggerated that it's illegible. It's supposed to be legible, but it goes too far. And then there's also a dyslexic typeface that we did look at, we took some thinking, but not much. We took some thinking into that about the letter ambiguity. But there's that dyslexic typeface that I'm thinking of. It looks like a ransom note. It's like, it's just impossible to read.
The brief, I mean, I love the question, I'll tell you why, because we have this with our client all the time. It's like, this brief is very specific to people's low vision. And those are those 5 cases that we shared. Those are physiological degeneration, right? These are things that are 9 times out of 10 somebody was sighted, is losing their sight because there's something physically happening to them. Dyslexia is cognitive as well as physical. And this wasn't designed for that. You know, this was designed literally to take care of the issues, the fuzzy edges that you're starting to see. But that's the conversation, right? Like, that's exactly it. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's like, this is a tool that's designed specifically to help with this. That same, and it has. I mean, I know we've had people reach out to us who have developed the fonts. They put the same verve into what they're doing because they're working against a different set of issues. The thing that's important, though, is now there's dialogue around it, right? People are recognizing that it isn't just one thing. It's multiple things, and it's going to require multiple approaches to the problem to be able to basically collectively make things accessible for people.
I sat in on this low vision test. I was watching the low vision experts test the typeface with somebody, and they had a stroke, right? They had had a stroke, and that affected their vision. That's why they were at the Braille Institute. And they were reading C-A-T, and they kept saying dog, right? And like, can you repeat what the letters say? C-A-T, right. So what does it spell? Dog. And nothing we do will fix that. We cannot solve for that. And I mean, that's an extreme example, but
The font face.
the typeface won't fix that.
And that's
but-
what you got to recognize with this stuff, right? It plays a role, but this is in concert with like care teams and with people's tenacity. And it's like, it's just one thing that just makes your life a little bit easier again, right? And it can have a big impact. So.
I think I want to talk a little bit about why Braille were so happy for us to create this font. It was a boatload of work, as you can imagine. It was a lot of hours. But it really helped them start the conversation, be part of that conversation, change people's opinions about their role in that community. And we're super hopeful it spawns other things, like people creating typefaces in different styles or for different purposes.
How many weights does this come in?
4 at the moment. There's a regular and a bold, and a regular italic and a bold italic. And it's going to be released 2020. Yeah. Early 2020, we'll say.
Braille Institute applying it to other things other than branding materials?
They're using it for their signage and stuff. They're using it in environmental spaces. Yeah, and website?
Yeah, I mean, they're using it for everything they can use it for, and that's their goal.
Yeah.
And the goal is to use it as much as possible, and that's what's going to drive the screen question, right? It's like once we start to see that get out in the world, we'll start making those adjustments. Yes.
I have 2 questions. So my first question is, I'm wondering, like, what are some of the difficult situations you encounter during the development of this typeface? And the second question is, are we going to see like any book that is printed by this hyperlegible typeface in the future?
I'll start with the second question. Yes, I would imagine so. I mean, I think when it's publicly available, I think a lot of people will use it. We've had lots of inquiries about how to get hold of it. Just people just finding our email addresses and hunting us down and emailing us. So I think we're sure that it will be published in that way. I think, I know you or Megan should answer the questions about the challenges. I want to say probably one of the biggest challenges was just keeping going.
Yeah. Yeah, 240 characters 4 times is like, a lot of work. Drawing each character like 10 times, 20 times, whatever, is like immense. And then kerning is a nightmare and all those kind of things. But are we doing the right thing, right? Is this going to affect, are we making the right decisions? That's what keeps me up, I guess.
And then just having the financial wherewithal to be able to do it, right? I mean, can't underestimate that. We have a client who's willing to invest in it. We're investing in it. And just, it's like, with that perseverance comes time, which I hate to say it, but it costs money, right? And it's like, I read this amazing article. I forgot the typeface, but it's the new highway typeface. I don't know if you guys have ever read that story, but it was Studio kind of did it on a lark 20 years ago, and they're like, we're still working on it, right? And he's like, I think maybe the first installation happened in the last couple of years. He's like, oh my gosh, like, he goes, I didn't want this to be like what defined like 20 years of my life, but there it is, right? But you know, having commitment from people who want to see it come to life, and I mean that as a veiled way of saying financially wanting to see that come to life is pretty remarkable. I think we can underestimate that part of it. I'm the business guy.
Well, I think to add to that a little bit, like, because we own the business, we can say it's all right to not make a lot of money and still spend a lot of time on a project.
Do you know if there's any correlation between what, like an OCR software recognizing characters? Is it related to low sight or trying to recognize characters? Is it a totally different algorithm?
Yeah, it's a factor that we thought about, but I mean, we didn't test OCR particularly. It was about people reading it, and
Wasn't machine reading.
yeah.
I don't know, it's an interesting question. We don't have to answer it.
But it's a new question to add to the list.
Yeah.
That look that we just gave each other.
It was like, oh crap, now we got to do this.
Wow, yeah, I haven't got that one yet. It's great.
Did the italic present any unique challenges?
Good question.
Maybe you want to answer that one?
Other than the fact it was just more difficult, I think it made it a little easier because it came after. We did the regular and bold first, so most of the problems were encountered there. But
The thing about italics is like,
more difficult by nature.
yeah, they're just by their style, like what they look like. They're harder to read, right?
Not meant to be.
Yeah, but you don't read a lot much. You only read like one word at a time, or two, whatever. So it's a different. There's different threshold for like what's acceptable or not, right? Yeah, the typeface, the italics, it's basically an oblique version of the Roman, but there's little differences here and there, but it doesn't have to work as hard. Oh, third question.
I would imagine kerning too is a whole other issue. You
Yeah.
build your own kerning tables, or is there another thought that goes into that?
No, we went with the standard kerning tables. Something like lowercase I, it doesn't normally stick out, so we adjusted for those kind of things. As a general sort of rule, we kerned it or tracked it a little wider than what you would normally expect, just so that the letters didn't crash into each other. Made sure that each letter's understood easily, but not so wide that it all falls apart.
By the way, that's one of the drivers that you're asking for principles, and it's one of the drivers of legibility, is that balance between letter spacing.
Yeah.
To make sure, because that's like, and that's what we saw, especially with the testing, like when they were closer together, people's ability to scan it went way down.
Yeah, it's one thing to differentiate a cap B from an 8, but then does this O crash into a lowercase L? Does it look like a D? That's a whole other thing. So we erred on the side of like spacing it out a little bit more, but again, not so much that it's a disparate set of letters. We want it to still be clearly words. And then when we set the typeface in like the brochures and stuff, increase the lighting. We made sure that the lines read in a sort of natural way, sort of doing the ragging real purposefully to make sure that it's just easier to follow, all those kind of components.
Yes.
At what point in the project did you sell a client on a custom typeface? Was that part of the original proposal?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny. It's Brad and I have both together tried to sell a bespoke typeface to a corporation before, and it was an uphill slog, incredibly expensive, and never made it past the first phase.
Michael Beirut was able to do it with the same client.
Then, but when we showed it to Braille and explained there isn't really a typeface that does the job that your brand is trying to do on many fronts, but in typography there isn't a typeface that can do it, but we could try to build one. They were like, let's do it. I don't think they fully understood how much work it was going to be, but they were into it.
Yeah. It wasn't at the proposal stage, but it was at the first concept stage. Like when we shared the design, here's like what it could look like. That's when it was talked about, right?
And it was only shown. So I mean, Craig did a wonderful job selling it. So he was being a little modest there. I mean, basically we went in with this and a couple different logos.
Yeah.
And the question of the typeface just was completely off the table because it was the answer, right? And look, we're kind of, I am anyway, I'm kind of a boring guy, so we don't typically just go, oh, here's your one answer and walk out, you know, we're not like Paul Mann or somebody. But it was one of those moments where it really was that. It was like, this is it. And stylistically, the reason why you like this is because this is the font that's being used.
Yeah. In the concept stage, we hadn't built the working typeface, so we just sort of drew some of the characters, like caps in the lowercase and a couple of punctuation things, and hand set everything for the concepts. That was a huge amount of work, but it worked. It was worth it. Yeah, it got the idea across enough. For headlines and stuff. For lower level copy, we just use like Helvetica, but yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing presentation because they loved what the typeface meant for their community, but also for shifting the perception of who they are in that industry or that community. So they liked that. And then the other crazy thing in the presentation was Elliot wrote a blind joke that went into the presentation. And it was great.
I didn't write it, I found it. But I put it in.
I had to deliver it, so that was a little different. So I'm in a room full of executive people, some of which have low vision, and one person was blind. But it was a test of the positioning, right? The positioning was really about not holding back and just like giving it your all, defying the blindness to the point of like, this will not define me, I'm going to define myself. So just go past it. Which is not who they had been in the years previous, but it's who they were trying to become. So when one of the posters said, a blind man walks into a bar and a table. Like I delivered the line, and the lady who was blind laughed so hard she snorted. So I was so pleased that I was not the one who did the doing that. And also it proved like how much courage they really were going to have.
Yeah, when you go there, when you go to the Braille Institute, the first time I went, I was like kind of really nervous. I was like, oh god, it's gonna be like blind people everywhere. But I was nervous. I was like, I didn't want it to be this like solemn, sort of miserable place, and it wasn't that at all. It's this brutalist building, sure, but like it's full of life. It's full of laughter. Everybody's happy. It's like not what I was expecting, and so. It gave us license to sort of like do something crazy like this.
Yeah, I think that was very encouraging. Like, not that I built the typeface, Megan and Elliot did it, but like knowing that this makes such a difference in people's lives makes you really want to work hard and do the right thing for them. So when we were talking about should we really do this typeface, people might hate us. Typographers might think it's a terrible idea. But no, it's the right reason we should do it. That laughter helps you make that decision.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Were you curious about doing like some heavier weights, and at some point you decided, it's not going to be hyperlegible, it's too heavy?
Yes, that is a good question. There's a reason that the bold and the regular are sort of the ones that we went with. Going too light, it sort of breaks up, and going too heavy, it clouds together, and something in the middle, like a medium sort of weight, it's hard to differentiate the weights there as well. So it's like we need a bold and we need a regular to help break up information. And if you put something in the middle of that, again, it sort of like smudges it all together. Yeah. That being said, I want to do one lighter one and one heavier one, but only a little bit, just a little bit. But then it's like a whole amount of work. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?